Good evening and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Dinesh D'Souza, and this is part of the Bradley Lecture Series. There's been an interesting debate that has emerged both inside the academy and outside about the issue of Afrocentrism, the teaching of young people in schools from an African or Afrocentric point of view. And this argument, of course, has risen in resistance to the previously powerful or dominant mode of thinking, which has been classified, rightly or wrongly, as Eurocentric. What do these terms mean? What is their genesis? What is their relationship to each other? Probably there are a few people more qualified to talk about this than our speaker. Professor Anthony Appiah is a native of Ghana. He is a citizen of the United Kingdom, and he is a professor of Afro-American Studies and Philosophy at Harvard University. He is also an editor of Transition magazine, which is a magazine that for many years was very influential in the Africa debate and has now been revived at Harvard under the editorship of Henry Louis Gates. Professor Appiah is also chairman of the Joint Committee on African Studies of the Social Science Research Council, and he is president of the Society for African Philosophy in North America. He will speak for 45 minutes, followed by questions and answers, and afterward there will be a reception next door. I also want to remind you that next month, June 8th, Donald Kagan will be speaking on Periclean Athens and modern democracy. So please join me in welcoming Professor Appiah.
Thank you very much, Dinesh. I will, if I get these organized properly, then I won't have to take any notice of them. Dinesh asked me to talk about fallacies of Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism, so that is what I propose to do. Modern academic history, the discipline, was invented in Germany somewhat over a century ago with Ranke's slogan that we should tell the tale wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually happened. But the birth of modern historical method coincided with the rise in England of imperial sentiment, with the rediscovery in France of the distinctiveness or alleged distinctiveness of the Republic, in Germany and Italy of modern nationalism, and with an intense preoccupation in the United States, especially in the literary area, with the meaning of America. The result is that the first modern histories are nationalist. They are stories of the coming into being of nations from the point of view of the new national ideologies and identities created in the very processes they sought to describe. It's an important fact that even scientific history is written by the victors. It's not just that nationalist history hides from view the local particularities that threaten the project of creating a unitary modern identity, so that Wales and Scotland and Ireland, or the Basque Country, or Catholic Bavaria, or the American South can find their distinctiveness deliberately written out of the story. Something much more subtle than this occurs as we think back over the past from the perspective of the present, namely that we're bound to see ourselves and thus our values as the end of the process, and we risk coming to see the triumph of these values as inevitable. This is more than a merely intellectual mistake. In seeing the values of the present as the inevitable result of the historical process, we neglect the contingency of history, the fact that what happens is not always what must happen, that sometimes it is luck or courage or intelligence, and not fate, that has brought us where we are. And that can leave us ill-prepared to make the future. Well, these reflections are, at a horrifying level of abstraction, are relevant to my topic today, fallacies of Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism, because at the present, from the point of view of the West, it's tempting to see the triumph of values, institutions, and ideas derived from the West as inevitable, as a necessary victory, as what some have called the end of history. From our perspective here, it's natural to look out on a world dominated by the West, where even the major remaining resistance to it notably, of course, among the quarter of the human population that's Chinese, is based in Marxism, the product of a Western thinker whose low credit in the contemporary West does not obscure his central place in Western intellectual history. When persecuted writers in Kenya or in East Timor or in Beijing speak to the world for aid, they talk in the language of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. They appeal to the language of the American founding. They speak in the terms invented by the great liberal theorists of the English 17th century. They speak in the language of Locke. There are at least two ways in which the representation of these facts as a triumph of the West are misleading. First, because such a way of thinking ignores the very long-standing role of people and products from outside the West in the shaping of this intellectual and cultural heritage. The mistake here is the mistake of thinking that what is Western is only Western. We do not need to agree with the more extreme Afrocentrists to notice that the Greece to which this West looks back was at the crossroads of culture of North Africa and the ancient Near East as well as of Europe. The Spain that began the conquest of the New World had been deeply shaped by Islam. The Renaissance rediscovery of ancient learning owed a great deal to the Arabs who preserved that tradition through what in Europe were called the Dark Ages. And the economic basis of modern capitalism depended on the labor of Africans, the gold and silver of New World Indians, and the markets of Asia. The West that has triumphed acquired its gunpowder from China, the astronomical data on which was based the beginnings of the scientific revolution from the ancient Near East. These examples are familiar enough, but rehearsing them should remind us how true it is that the modern West was invented at the same time as culture and the economy, so to speak, went global. To use an example I learned of only recently myself, musicologists now argue, as I learned in passing from a recent conference paper by Susan McClary, that the rhythmic structure of Monteverdi's Chaconne may derive either from Peruvian Indian or from African musics. If the latter is correct, the first European dance craze with an Afro beat may have been a few centuries earlier than most of us had realized. So the first way it's misleading to think of the triumph of capitalism and of liberal ideology as Western is that to do so is to forget that what made these successes possible was surely, in some measure, the openness of the West to ideas and products and people from the rest of the world. But it's also misleading because the triumph of capitalism and of liberalism that we're seeking to explain is a far more complex set of facts than the simple notion of the transfer of our ideas and practices over there would imply. There are people here more qualified than I am to talk about what the triumph of capitalism might mean, but let me note only that monetization and markets are much older than European domination of the globe, and that many cultures have taken to the market not as a Western institution, but as something that continues traditions of their own. So far as liberalism is concerned, I'm not sure that we should read too much into talk of human rights. I doubt that most people in the modern West have much sense of what that might be thought by a philosopher to mean, and I'm sure that this is even more true for many who appeal to the notion elsewhere. What appeals about the language of rights is the notion of having some standard on which to call when you are being tortured, displaced, abused, or threatened with rape or death. This is not a Western idea, but a human one. Still, because the West is so overwhelmingly the center of power on the planet, it is inevitable that these appeals will be made in our language. Well, because this is how I see the shaping of our increasingly global cultural situation, which of course has not yet produced a single global culture, but rather a world of many cultures in often rather asymmetrical interaction, I think there is much to be said for the critique of the ethnocentrism of much older scholarship in Europe and North America that sought to understand the West, our civilization, without a vivid appreciation of the range and the depth of its interdependence with peoples and cultures outside. I think it's true enough if one looks at the histories that scholars have written over the last century or so, they have often been what we now call Eurocentric. The term deserves a definition. By Eurocentrism is meant, to begin with, a scholarship which understands European history, intellectual life, and social institutions as a sort of ideal type, both normatively and descriptively. But Eurocentric work also displays an inability, often rooted in prejudice, to enter sympathetically into the forms of life of non-Europeans, and especially of black people, people of African descent. Ethnocentrism, in this first sense, taking Europe as the explanatory norm, is not the prevailing assumption of all scholarship. It is notable, for example, in the work of the founders of modern social analysis, Weber, Marx, Durkheim, that they were deeply interested in understanding modes of production and forms of life and thought different from those of the modern West, and that they held that we needed to understand all forms of human life if we were to understand our own. And while, like all people, Western scholars have been Eurocentric in the second sense, prejudiced, even racist, it's also true that intellectual life in Europe, at least since Romanticism, has often proceeded on the assumption that there was much of great value and something superior to our arts in traditions from outside. One is no longer entitled to treat modern history as an uninterrupted arc of progress. In a century that contains the Holocaust, this is not just a matter of political correctness. But there has been an increasing preoccupation in Western social and cultural analysis with attempts at objectivity and critiques of ethnocentric bias within the fields of anthropology and sociology and within the humanities. And this means that, by and large, there would be few scholars, even among my most reactionary colleagues, who would defend either the taking of European culture as the explanatory norm or the ill-informed anti-African and anti-Asian prejudices of the past. It is, I think, against that background that we should reflect on the stream of publications over the past few years, especially in the United States, aimed at establishing a new basis for the study and teaching of African and African-American culture. Whether or not they actually use the word Afrocentric on their packaging, these books, which differ enormously in the quality of their thought and writing, as well as in their factual reliability, have a certain common set of assumptions whose persistence entitles one now to speak of a broadly Afrocentric paradigm. The consensus about which these works are organized has two basic elements, one critical, the other positive, which are either argued or taken for granted in them all. The negative thesis is that modern Western scholarship on cultural matters, high and low, is hopelessly Eurocentric. As a consequence of this Eurocentrism, Western scholarship proposes, so the story goes, that Africans have produced little of much cultural worth, and that cultural works of sophistication or value, like the architecture of Great Zimbabwe or the pyramids, even when they are in Africa, is usually likely to have been produced, unlikely to have been produced by black people. Now, in support of this Eurocentricity thesis, some, and occasionally a great deal, of work goes into showing that European scholars, at least since the Enlightenment, have set about to conceal facts about the African origins of certain central elements of Western civilization, notably both the Egyptian origins of the Greek miracle and the black African origins of the Egyptian miracle. This negative thesis is argued as the prolegomenon to an alternative, positive, Afrocentric view in which African cultural creativity is discovered to have been at the origin of Western civilization, and Western civilization, especially in modernity, is either asserted or implied to be intrinsically morally depraved, incapable in particular, Westerners being incapable in particular of living peacefully with others. We, sometimes all of us, sometimes just those of us who are black, are urged then to center on African history, and particularly the history of Egypt and of the pharaohs, and return to African values. This Afrocentric paradigm is not just the source of a lively body of writing, it is the basis, too, of a movement in the United States to revise the teaching of African American children, to provide them with an Afrocentric education. Here the argument is that the Eurocentricity of what is taught in American schools at best fails to nurture and at worst actively damages the self-esteem of black children, and that what these children need instead is a diet of celebratory African history, also beginning in Egypt and insisting that its civilization was black, and, along with that, the transmission of African values. These values are often taught now in the version developed by Dr. Maulana Karenga and associated with the invention of a feast called Kwanzaa, designed to provide an African celebration to go with Christmas and Hanukkah. American children are taught Swahili words, naming various allegedly African virtues as their proper inheritance. There's something of an irony in the use of Swahili as an Afrocentric language, since hardly any of the slaves brought to the New World can have known the language, while it was in fact being used in a culture in which slave trading to the Arabian Peninsula was a major element of the economy. This particular brand of Afrocentrism goes under the label of Kemetism, Kemet being a name for ancient Egypt, And the whole package can be found in a recent work by Molefe Ketiasanti, one of the intellectual leaders of the movement, entitled Kemet, Afrocentricity and Knowledge. At least as important as published work is a body of Afrocentric law transmitted in public lectures and in discussion groups by figures like Leonard Jeffries, who have tended in recent years to combine the Afrocentric paradigm with a peculiar anti-Semitism, which seems preoccupied with placing especially responsibility for the ills of the black world on a Jewish conspiracy. Some of the leading rap stars seem to subscribe to this package of views, combining it with their well-known misogyny and homophobia to produce a cultural brew as noxious as any currently available in popular culture. The diagnosis of this particular cultural pathology is the subject of much current speculation among observers of the African American cultural scene. The Afrocentric paradigm, the scholarly end of the movement, has one major hero, Cheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese man of letters, after whom the university in Dakar, Senegal, is now named. Diop argued over many years, beginning in the 1950s, for the thesis of the African origins of Greek civilization. In a whole host of works, he pursued a complex agenda in which the splendors of Egypt were a basis for contemporary African pride, and the cultural unity derived from a common African source could be the basis of a modern African political unity. Like most cultural movements at full flood, this Afrocentric turn is a composite of truth and error, insight and illusion, moral generosity and meanness. But if there's one thing that strikes me more about it than any other, it is how thoroughly at home it is in the frameworks of 19th century European thought. One of the symptomatic features of much Afrocentric writing is that the antagonists it identifies are largely dead. Afrocentrism, in short, seems very much to share the presuppositions of the Victorian ideologies against which it's supposed to be reacting. Take, for example, the preoccupation with the ancient world. The academic curriculum of the 19th century traced Western civilization to roots in ancient Greece, eventually, after arguments about whether it shouldn't be traced in the case of Britain back to the Teutonic forests, following a history of progress from the excellent beginnings mapped out by the heirs of Homer. Our Afrocentrists have bought into this way of doing cultural history and have only challenged the priority of the white Greeks, replacing it with the priority of the black Egyptians. There are, of course, genuine issues for discussion here about the relations between different parts of the ancient Mediterranean and the Greek miracle. Martin Bernal, not by my accounts an Afrocentrist because he doesn't support the positive agenda of the movement, is a hero for Afrocentrists because he's taken on, in his well-known book, Black Athena, the challenge of refuting the modern view that the Greeks owed nothing of importance to Egypt. So far as I can see, there seems to be now a consensus that Bernal convincingly demonstrates the role of prejudice against blacks and Jews in classical scholarship in the Enlightenment and since, while not establishing decisively his own positive account of ancient history. But it's not this perfectly interesting and potentially genteel academic debate that has drawn Bernal to the Afrocentrist attention. For their purposes, it is essential not only to agree with Bernal's account of ancient intellectual history, but also to insist, in the words of Cheikh Anta Diop, translated from the French, that ancient Egypt was a Negro civilization, and the moral fruit of their civilization is to be counted among the assets of the black world. And on this matter, Bernal has very little to say. Fortunately, he doesn't have to argue for this secondary thesis, since it's taken to be implicit in his title. African Athena, or Egyptian Athena, the titles he himself favored, would have left the racial issue open, or, where I think it belongs, to one side. Black Athena, the publisher's idea, does not. It is this preoccupation with racial matters that is so much a response to the 19th century framing of the issues. What was added in the 19th century to the classicism of the Enlightenment was the thought that the Western heritage was a racial possession. This story neglects not only Egyptian influences on the Greeks, to whatever extent there were any, but such minor embarrassments as the centrality of Jewish contributions to Western high culture and the key role of the Arabs in maintaining the intellectual tradition that linked Plato to the Renaissance. And it depends on a way of thinking of culture and biology which is bound to be discomfited by those scholars, black, brown, and yellow, who have taken possession of Western culture in the 20th century and mastered it, at the very same time as many of the supposed racial heirs of the West have been immersed in a popular culture contaminated with African rhythms. But in our day, racialism doesn't need arguing against in serious company. We all know that there is biology and there is culture, that their interconnections and interdependencies are complex and multiply mediated, that the old simplicities of racialism have not stood the test of exposure to the evidence. Or do we? After all, the Afrocentrist interest in the color of the ancient Egyptians presumably derives from the thought that if they were black, then they were of the same race as contemporary black Africans and their New World cousins. It's indeed a standard feature of Afrocentric argument to go through a series of claims about the physical anthropological evidence for the priority of in various domains of black-skinned people. And it's unclear to me why, if you don't conflate biology and culture, you should care about this question. It's hard to find in the Afrocentrist literature a clearer answer to the question why we should than the passage from Diop I quoted earlier. Racial identity with the Egyptians makes their achievements one of the moral assets of contemporary blacks. Of course, if Greece grew out of Egypt and the West grew out of Greece, then the West is one of the moral assets of contemporary blacks, and its legacy of ethnocentrism is presumably one of our moral liabilities. But I digress. Perhaps this is why Black Athena and African Origins of Civilization, which contains translated selections from Diop's Antériorité des civilisations nègres, sell so well on the streets of Harlem. And if it is, this is a reason that would have been entirely congenial to the 19th century Eurocentrists, whom Afrocentricity aims to refute. Well, once you see the essentially reactive structure of this kind of Afrocentrism, it's like what they said about Marx and Hegel, it's Eurocentrism turned upside down, you can understand where its intellectual weaknesses will lie. It's not surprising, for example, that in choosing to talk about Egypt and ignore the rest of Africa and African history, Afrocentrism shares the European prejudice against cultures without writing. Eurocentrism finds a literate culture and significant architecture Eurocentrism finding a literate culture and significant architecture set about claiming that Egypt could not be black. Afrocentrism chooses Egypt because Eurocentrism had already made a claim on it. Similarly, we shan't be surprised at what is one of the most tiresome features of Afrocentrism, namely its persistence in what the Beninois philosopher and current Minister of Culture, Paulin Tonji, has called unanimism, the view that there is an African culture to which to appeal. It's surely prima facie preposterous to suppose that there is an African culture shared by everyone from the civilizations of the Upper Nile thousands of years ago to the 1,000 or so language zones of contemporary Africa. Here too, in aiming to identify some common core of African civilization, the Afrocentrists seem to be responding to earlier attempts to identify a common core of Western culture. Wandering as I have from Venice to Venice Beach, or from York to New York, one can be forgiven for wondering how unitary the West really is today. But it was always a strange idea that Alexander and Alfred and Frederick the Greats had something deeply in common with each other and with the least of their subjects, which could be called Western culture. And in Africa, where whatever continuity there has been through all this time has not been mediated by even the sort of broken textual tradition that in some sets unites something called Western civilization, it's not only a strange idea, it's a silly one. A final irony is worth pointing out. Afrocentrism, which is offered in the name of black solidarity, has by and large entirely ignored the work of African scholars other than Diop. This fact tends to be concealed because the African-American scholars in this field, like Asante and Karenga, have adopted African names. Thus, much play has been given to another major source book for the Afrocentric, Jan-Heinz Jahn's Muntu, African Cultures in the Western World, a work that first appeared in the United States with great éclat in the early 1960s. The book revolves around the concept, I'm inclined to say the alleged concept, of Ntu. This is the stem of the Kinyarwanda Bantu words Muntu, Kintu, Hantu, and Kuntu, which mean respectively person, thing, place or time, and modality. I'm not sure what modality means, but that's what it says in the book. And it's a morpheme that doesn't occur unprefixed in Kinyarwanda. Ntu, John wrote with the gravitas of revelation, is the universal force as such. Reading this, I found myself irresistibly drawn into a fantasy in which an African scholar returns to her home in Lagos or Nairobi with the important news that she has uncovered the key to Western culture. Soon to be published, Thing, Western Culture and the African World, a work that exposes the philosophy of ing, written so clearly on the face of the English language. For ing, in the Euro-American view, is the inner dynamic essence of the world. In the very structure of the words making and doing and meaning, the English, and thus by extension all Westerners, express their deep commitment to this conception. But the secret heart of matter is captured in their primarily ontological category of the thing. Every thing, or being, as their sages express the matter in the more specialized vocabulary of one of their secret societies, is not stable, but ceaselessly changing. Here we see the fundamental explanation for the extraordinary neophilia of Western culture, its sense that reality is change. Well, the notion that there is something unitary called African culture that could be summarized in this sort of way has been subjected to devastating critique by a generation of African intellectuals. But little sign of African accounts of African culture appears in the writings of Afrocentricity. Molefi Asante has written whole books with Akan culture at the heart of them, without referring to the major works of Akan philosophers such as J.B. Dankwa, Ph.D., London, thesis on Aristotle, William Abrahams, Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, also working on Aristotle, Kwesi Wiredu, another Oxford man, and Kwame Jetchi, finally a Harvard Ph.D., who worked on Arabic logic. And I'm reliably informed that on one occasion not so long ago, a distinguished Zairian intellectual was told by a famous Afrocentrist that, and I'm quoting roughly, "We don't need you educated Africans coming here to tell us about African culture." In the last half of this talk, I want to take up the question of how we might negotiate between the Scylla of older Eurocentrism and the Charybdis of the new Afrocentrism. And despite the fact that I'm speaking here at the American Enterprise Institute, or perhaps since I'm a philosopher and so intellectually perverse because of it, I'm going to do it under the banner of multiculturalism. I do so with some reluctance, however. Normally, I'm not much one for isms, and talk of multiculturalism makes me as nervous as the many other isms that surround us. Multiculturalism sounds like the name of an ideology, an agenda, a unified political vision, and if there is such a unified ideology out there, I certainly don't know what it is. What I do know is that in some sense of the much abused word culture, we live in a society of many cultures, something that is reasonable to call a multicultural society. Now, the idea of culture is much abused because our word is so elastic. But we can reduce it to some kind of order, the range of our uses, by identifying a spectrum that begins with the most basic sense of the term, which I think of as the anthropologist sense, the sense in which culture means all the ideas and practices shared by a social group, and ends with what we call high culture, a critical notion of culture, which picks from among those ideas a subset that, amongst other things, require great training and individual skill. The habit of shaking hands at meetings belongs to culture in the anthropologist sense. Sandro Botticelli, Martin Buber, and Count Basie belong to culture in the anthropologist sense also, but they also belong to culture in the critical sense. Now, no one is likely to make much fuss about the fact that a society is multicultural in the critic sense. For in that sense, most large-scale societies have been multicultural. Once you have division of labor and social stratification, there will be people who do and people who don't know about music and literature and pottery and painting. And if we call all these specialized spheres together high culture, then everyone will participate in high culture to varying degrees, and there are likely to be subgroups, opera lovers, say, or dedicated moviegoers or lovers of poetry, who share significant practices and ideas with each other that they don't share with everyone else. If being multicultural is a problem, it's because societies are multicultural in the anthropological sense. Pace those who seem preoccupied with stopping or starting multiculturalism at the NEH or the NEA, the problems created by our many cultures largely lie elsewhere. Culture in the anthropologist sense is what a social group has socially in common. It is what we teach our children in order to make them members of our social group. By definition, therefore, culture in this sense is shared. It is a kind of social bottom line. It includes language and table manners, religious ideals, moral values. And with this idea of culture goes the idea of a subculture, people who share not just the common ideas and practices of the whole social group, but also more specific other practices and values as well. Now, I say social group because a single society, a group of persons living together in a common state under common authorities need not have a common culture. There is no single shared body of ideas and practices in most African states today. There is, as we've learned so sadly in recent months, no such shared culture in Bosnia. And I think it's fair to say that there is not now, and there has never been, in this sense, a shared culture in the United States. The reason is simple. The United States has always been multilingual, has always had minorities who didn't speak or understand English. It's always had a plurality of religious traditions, beginning with Native American religions, and Puritans and Catholics, and the early Jewish immigrants, and including now many varieties of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, Baha'i, and so on. And Americans have always differed significantly, even among those who do speak English, who have always, of course, been a majority, from north to south and east to west, and from country to city, in customs of greeting, notions of civility, and a whole host of other ways, a fact that I discovered when I first moved to Durham, North Carolina from Ithaca, New York. At the same time, it's always been true that there was a dominant culture in these United States. It was Christian, it spoke English, and it identified with the high cultural traditions of Europe and more particularly of England. And until recently, when people spoke of American culture, that's what they meant. When they spoke of it, well, I digress again. As public education has expanded in the United States, America's citizens, and especially those citizens educated in public elementary schools in this country, have come to share a body of historical knowledge and an understanding of the American political system. And it's increasingly true that whatever other languages children in this country speak, they speak and understand English, and they watch many of the same television programs and listen to much of the same music. In that sense, most young Americans have a shared culture based in a whole variety of kinds of English, but it's no longer that older Christian Anglo-Saxon tradition that used to be called American culture. And in that sense, American culture today is probably less diverse than it has ever been. The outlines of this common culture, to which only very few Americans are external, are somewhat blurry, but it includes, for example, in its practices, baseball, in its ideas, democracy, in its rap, in its arts, rap music, and music videos, and many movies. This culture is, to a large extent, as I've implied, the product of schools and of the media. But even those who share this common culture, the shared cultural literacy of E.D. Hirsch, let us say, live in subcultures of language, religion, family organization, and political assumptions. And more than this, most who are black and Hispanic have, irrespective of their incomes, somewhat different experiences and expectations of the state. Now, I take it that multiculturalism is meant to be the name of a response to these familiar facts. It is meant to be an approach to education and to public culture that acknowledges the diversity of cultures and subcultures in the United States, and that proposes to deal with that diversity in some other way than by imposing the values and ideas of the hitherto dominant Anglo-Saxon cultural tradition. That, I think, is the common core of all the things that have been called multiculturalism. Now, I think this idea is a good one. It's a good idea for a number of reasons. It's a good idea, first, because the old practice of imposing Christian Anglo-Saxon tradition was rooted, in part, in racism and anti-Semitism, sexism and heterosexism, but that's another story. But it's a good idea, second, because the making of one ethnic group's culture, the official culture of a state, privileges the members of that subculture, gives them advantages in public life in ways that are profoundly anti-egalitarian and anti-democratic. Yet agreeing to this idea doesn't tell you much about what you should do in schools and in public culture. It tells you that you mustn't impose certain practices and ideas. It tells you that you mustn't especially impose them because they belong to a particular group. But it doesn't tell you what you should do affirmatively. And I want to suggest that one affirmative strategy in this area is a bad idea. One of the things proposed in the name of multicultural education is a bad idea, and that there are other strategies that are better. And then, in closing, I want to say something about why living together in a multicultural society is bound to turn out to be difficult. Many multiculturalists seem to think that the way to deal with the fact of our many cultures in the public education system is something like this: to teach each child the culture of its group. This is the strategy of many Afrocentrists and of some, but by no means all, of those who favored some kind of bilingual education for Spanish speakers. And this is the strategy that I oppose, and I want to explain why. To begin with, my first basis for objection, I need to elicit a paradox in this approach, which you can do by considering one Afrocentric answer to the question, why should we teach African American children something different from what we teach other children? This Afrocentric answer comes in two parts. The first part says that we should do so because they already come from a different culture. And the second part says we should do so because we should teach all people about their own traditions. Well, it's the first answer that seems to me paradoxical. It's paradoxical because it proposes to solve the problems created by the fact that children have different cultures by emphasizing and entrenching those differences, not by trying to reduce them. I should make it plain that I have no problem with the view that children's home cultures should be taken into account in deciding how to teach them. There's no point in talking to children in languages or dialects they don't understand, or in punishing them for something that their parents have been teaching them to do. But to admit that is to admit only that culture may sometimes make a difference to how you should teach, not that it should make a difference to what you should teach. And defending teaching children different histories, Afrocentric history, or different forms of speech or writing, Black English, on the grounds that this is already their culture, simply begs the question. If we teach African American children different histories from other children, then indeed it will become true that knowing that history and not knowing any other history will be part of the culture of African Americans. But the fact is that if we don't enforce cultural differences of this kind in the schools, they will largely disappear, cultural differences of this kind, differences in knowledge about American history. What that means is that the only serious argument for Afrocentricity that survives is the second answer I mentioned, the claim that you should teach each child the culture of its group, because that's the right thing to do, because that's what you should do. This idea is much more powerful. It's presumably at the basis of the thought that many non-observant Jews share with observant Jews who have other reasons for believing this, namely that it's good to teach their children Jewish history and customs because they are Jewish children. It's the argument, we have Plato to our father, that led to the sense of exclusion that many African Americans felt when the history and culture of the United States was taught to them as a continuation of a white Western tradition, the argument against which so much Afrocentrism is a reaction. Now, I myself am skeptical of all arguments of this form. I think that traditions are worth teaching because they are beautiful and good and true, not because they are yours or ours, mine or thine. I was brought up a Protestant, but after my first Seder, it struck me that this was a tradition worth teaching to everybody, Jew or Gentile, and I've always valued the experience of family community among my Muslim cousins at Ramadan, while also enjoying the food in the evenings. But this isn't the place to pursue this argument, because all I need to point out is that even if teaching children their history were good, it's not something that it would be practical for American public schools to do. For if carried to its ultimate, this policy would require state segregation into cultural groups, either within or between public schools, in ways that would be plainly unconstitutional in the United States since Brown. And if we did have unsegregated classes teaching Jewish history and African American history and Anglo history and Hispanic history and Chinese history in our schools, by what right would we forbid children from going to the wrong class? By what right would you say to the Korean American child, you're not allowed in the Afro-American history class, you should be listening to the history of Korea? Of course, there are things that we surely all believe that we should teach all American children. In particular, we should teach them something of the history of the American political system. And here too, and I think we should teach them the habits of argument and of mind that make democracy possible. And here too is another reason why we cannot hope to teach each child only its cultural tradition. For understanding the American constitutional system and its history requires us to know about slavery and immigration, the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Underground Railroad and Ellis Island, and so on. If there's a sense in which each of these belongs more to the history of some social groups than others, there's also a clear sense in which they belong to us all. And it's that idea that motivates the approach to dealing with our multicultural society that I favor, that undergirds my multiculturalism. For it seems to me that what is ideal in a multicultural society whose multicultural character is created outside the state, in the sphere that philosophers call civil society, is that the state should seek in its educational systems to make these multiple subcultures known to each other. A multicultural education, in my view, should be one that leaves you not only knowing and loving what is good in the traditions of your subculture, but also understanding and appreciating the traditions of others, and, yes, critically rejecting the worst in all traditions. This approach has its practical problems. A curriculum filled with the history of Korean Americans and African Americans and Anglo Americans and Jewish Americans and so on risks being a curriculum with a shallow appreciation of all. But the principle of selection is clear. We should try to teach about those many world traditions that have come to be important at different stages of American history. This means that we must begin with Native American and Protestant Dutch and English and African and Iberian cultures, adding voices to the story as they were added to the nation. Because different elements are important to different degrees in different places today within the United States, we can assume that the balance will be and should be differently struck in different places. There's a very diversified public education system in this country by comparison with almost all advanced industrial democracies, and I think that that's an asset. I have a final argument against Afrocentricity and such-like movements, which is that they're dangerous for reasons that have to do with the final point I want to make, which is about the difficulty of managing plural, multicultural societies. I said earlier that no one's likely to be troubled by the variety of subcultures in high culture. Why is that? It's because however important our participation in high culture is, it's unlikely to be at the heart of our ethnicity. High culture crosses ethnic boundaries to an extraordinary degree. The boundaries that it crosses with less ease are those of class. The result is that subdivisions of high culture are not so likely to become central to the organization of political life. The United States is not threatened by the cultural autonomy of the American Philosophical Association, to which I have the honor of belonging, or even of the American Medical Association, to which I have the honor of not belonging. In this respect, the associations of high culture are like many elements of popular culture. The next New York mayoral election is not going to be between followers of the Mets and of the Yankees. But differences in subcultures, this despite the fact that the distinction between the followers of the Mets and of the Yankees is very important in many areas of the lives of those followers. But differences in subcultures, in the anthropologist's sense of culture, are rather different. We pass on our language, our dialect, our notions of rhetoric to the next generation because we care to communicate with them. We pass on religion because we care for its vision and endorse its values. We pass on our folkways because we value people with those folkways. Culture, in this sense, is the home of what we care about most. If other people organize their solidarity around cultures different from ours, this makes them, to that extent, different from us in ways that matter to us deeply. The result, of course, is not just that we have difficulty understanding across cultures. That's an inevitable result of cultural difference because much of culture consists of shared modes of understanding. But that we end up preferring our own kind, and if we prefer our own kind, it's easy enough to slip into preferring to vote for our own kind, to employ our own kind, and so on. In sum, culture undergirds loyalties, and to the extent that these loyalties matter, they will be mobilized in politics, except to the extent that a civic culture can be created that explicitly seeks to exclude them. That is why the sort of multiculturalism that I endorse, my multiculturalism, is, I think, so necessary. It's the only way to reduce the misunderstandings across cultures, and the only way to build bridges of loyalty across ethnicities that have so often divided. Multiculturalism of this sort, pluralism, to use an older word, is the only way of making sure we care enough about people across ethnic divides to keep those ethnic divides from destroying us. The task for us teachers and scholars is not to replace one ethnocentrism with many, not to reject old ideals of truth and impartiality as intrinsically biased. Rather, it's to recognize that those ideals have yet to be fully lived up to in our scholarship and in our teaching. That this bias has derived not from scholars who took Western standards, which often turn out to be everybody's standards of truth, for granted, but that they didn't take them seriously enough. The problem, in other words, with the Eurocentrism, to the extent that it's there, of the Enlightenment, isn't that it's consistent with Enlightenment standards, is that it isn't consistent with Enlightenment standards. The old way of dealing with the problem of many cultures was to make us a pluribus unum. Anyone who appreciates, as I certainly do, the vibrancy of American popular and high culture, the splendid variety of our literatures and musics and cuisines, is likely to balk at such a homogenizing project. And anyone who's looked at our history and seen how often the one into which we were to be made was white and Anglo-Saxon and Protestant will be skeptical that the one into which we are to be made now could be anything other than the cover for the domination of one of our sectional cultures. These are, in my view, legitimate skepticisms. And the only alternative, so far as I can see, that doesn't threaten perpetual schism is the hard work of a multiculturalism that accepts America's diversity while teaching each of us the ways and the worth of others. Thank you.
For the questions, the only requirement is that you stand up and identify yourself.
I'm Vince Solito. I work at AEI here, and I also had the pleasure of attending Duke University while you were there, sir, in term. My question is harkens back to the beginning of your speech where you discussed the fact that it seems that history, again, written by the victors, but more importantly, that the ideals of the victorious societies then became viewed as the ideals of the world. I'm curious as to the political ideals of so-called Western society, the concepts of individual freedom and individual responsibility. Do you feel that these ideals are perhaps transcendent of a victorious culture? Are these concepts ones that would have survived if other cultures were victorious? Ideals that people come to on their own, perhaps why the Russian peoples rejected communism for so much time and tenure. Am I making myself clear?
Sure. Well, I think those kinds of counterfactuals, questions about what would have happened if things had gone very differently, are very difficult to assess. I don't think but I would say at least this on the question of what might have happened, that it seems to me completely unobvious that if at certain points, in fact in relatively recent history, in the history of the last few hundred years, if at certain points in that history things had gone differently, I think the world would have been very different. And I think the values dominant in the world would have been different. However, it's also true, I think, and here I think the mechanism by which this works is rather hard to understand, but there is a process something like this. The kind of individualism that you associate rightly with the history of the West, the recent history of the West, is something that I think of as in part connected with not simply the transmission of ideas, but with the incorporation of peoples around the world into a common, in particular, common economic system. And I think also that there is, I think that's one of the major forces is that increasingly, as you operate in a monetary economy, a certain kind of rationality, this is sort of Weberian, I suppose, a certain kind of rationality develops, a certain view of rationality, and that kind of rationality is one that's attached to the idea of the individual as the maximizer of his or her own good. But I think there are, which often gets translated into wealth, which I think is a mistake, since good is obviously more complicated than wealth. But there are other processes as well. For example, I think that plainly the spread of literacy has had tremendous impact on the intellectual life of the planet. And I think that literacy and literature, the novel, for example, are also connected culturally with the development of individualism and with the growth of a certain kind of notion of the value of the individual life and the sort of individual life that's narrated in the bourgeois novel. So I think there are lots of historical processes, and I think that many of them could have gone other ways than the way they did. I can't claim to be glad about all of them, the way that they've all gone. I mean, I think this century has been a pretty rough one from the point of view of mass murder, for example, and the technology that made most of those mass murders possible was developed in the West as well, and we need to learn how to control those technologies in ways that stop that stop things like the tens of millions of people who were killed by the Stalinists and by Stalin, and the half a dozen million people killed by the Nazis and so on, and the several million or so killed by Pol Pot. I mean, these are distinctively modern tragedies, and they're made possible in part by a certain kind of modern technology, and we desperately need, I think, ways to think about them. And I frankly don't think that anybody has yet, Western or anybody else, has really mastered the cultural and intellectual and moral resources that are necessary to deal with this kind of thing, as we are seeing now as mass murder breaks out all over the place. So that's not really an answer to your question, except to say that I think that we shouldn't think that, I do think things would have been different if at certain key points, certain different certain battles had been lost that were in fact won. And so there's a certain amount of contingency, I think, in what happened. And that's one of the reasons why I think looking back from the values that were produced by this process is likely to produce a kind of distorted view unless we remember that it could have gone in other ways.
Erwin Stelzer, AEI. Two questions. One, very early on in your talk, you referred in this question of victors and losers, and you said the losers were deliberately written out of the story.
Yeah, very often in the official national histories that were taught in French education, say, as in the Republic.
I was just thinking it's very difficult in America to write the South out of the story of the Civil War. They keep writing back.
That's right. Yes.
But I take you were referring to certain societies which created.
I'm talking about the ways in which I mentioned something that I think is very important about the United States, which is the non-centralized character of its public education, which distinguishes it very sharply from Britain and France and Germany and Italy.
And the second is, I'm not sure I understood one of the points. You said that in some societies, when threatened with various tragedies, rape, murder, etc., you use the phrase "some standard on which to call."
Yes.
In those circumstances. I just didn't follow the point. I wonder if you'd mind repeating it briefly.
Well, if you didn't understand it, it's probably not a good idea for me to repeat it. Maybe I should try and make it some other way. The point that I was trying to suggest is that one of the ways in which talk of rights, human rights, now is motivated is by the thought that appeal to these notions is now a usable mode of argument in getting certain governments to stop doing certain beastly things. And that's true for reasons that don't depend upon adherence to any particular philosophical understanding of notions of human rights. It's dependent only on the thought that it looks like in this world this is a usable vocabulary for getting people in on your side. And I take that to be a very good thing. And I take that to be a very good thing in ways that mean that I regard the question of what we should do about that as separate from the philosophical question of whether you should be a realist about, a moral realist, or in the philosopher's sense, that is, as opposed to an idealist or a constructivist, whether you should think of the question of how philosophically you should ground the notion of natural rights. This seems to me such a powerful, usable idea for purposes that all sorts of people with perhaps rather different substantive moral views can nevertheless agree on, that it's an example of something I think is a very good move. But it works in part because the dominant, or it works to the extent that the world's dominant culture places value in rights. And we see this now in the debates. I was saying to Dinesh earlier that I was in Amsterdam last weekend and I was watching the debate in the British Parliament on the BBC, which you can get in Amsterdam, about Bosnia. And it's very interesting that one of the most striking things for me about this debate was that the sides were not left and right. there's massive division in the Labour Party, there's massive division in the Conservative Party, there's slightly less division among the Social Democrats, but then there's so relatively few of them. And I think this is a very important moment for the usability of that notion of an appeal to rights, I mean, or an appeal to, of that kind of moral appeal. And I think while it's clear that we should bear in mind always, just for the sake of prudence, what the real costs are likely to be of trying to operationalize such a notion, and both human and financial costs, it does seem to me that it's something that should weigh very heavily in the balance. And there are people all over the planet who have no idea about Locke, or there are people all over Washington who have no idea about Locke, but I mean there are people all over the planet who have no idea about Locke, who find this a usable vocabulary for resisting tyranny and oppression, and I think that that's an example of something productive that's happened in the last few hundred years. We've developed, or we are developing, a common vocabulary for making those kind of moral appeals, and it's a vocabulary that works despite the deep divisions and uncertainties of the philosophical foundations of the notion. So.
Yeah, Norman Grant.
Hi.
As I understand Afrocentricity, it's being taught in order to make the connection between African Americans here and Africans in Africa. How much evidence is there that ancient Egypt, or what they call Upper Egypt, which was Nubia, correct? How much evidence is it that they actually were principal in building the pyramids and all of that? And also, how much evidence is there that slaves were brought across the coast, I mean across the continent, to bring them over here? So you see what I'm getting at?
From the same region, you mean?
Right. In other words, what is our literal connection to the ancient Nubians, Ethiopians, the people that supposedly built these pyramids?
Well, the notion of a literal connection has to be cashed out in some particular way. You can think of it, one kind of literal connection would be, which would interest certain kinds of physical anthropologists, would be to trace the proportion of genes that came in the African American gene pool, say, that came from different parts of Africa. That would be one kind of literal connection. Because that's not a very good way of measuring these things, because despite appearances notwithstanding, the degree of biological difference between different human populations is relatively small, if you count it in terms of genes in that way. And so while there are people who are preoccupied with this question, they're not mostly biologists, because this turns out to be something of not very great biological significance. If you cash out the notion of a literal connection in cultural terms, if you say, how much of the culture of Cuba, or of Bahia, or of New Orleans, or of Harlem, or of Atlanta, or of the Mississippi Delta, comes from which places in Africa, then these are questions that current history and anthropology investigate in relation to African Americans. And I think the answer is that the connections that it's easiest to establish are ones with West African cultures in ways that reflect the changing pattern of the slave trade, which, as you know, began, roughly speaking, with the dominant source in Senegambia and moved down the coast through a period when it was the Gulf of Guinea, and ended up in the last period of the slave trade. The last slaves tended to come from the Angola, sort of that region, though, as you probably know, the last Yoruba-speaking slaves were probably imported into Cuba in the 1863 or something like that, I mean, quite late on, and they went on coming into Brazil even later. So I think that it's pretty clear now that there's good reason to suppose that there are significant and interesting cultural connections to be explored between a number of contemporary West African cultures and their cultural ancestors, and contemporary African American cultures in the whole of the New World. I think it is completely undemonstrated what the connection is between, say, Yoruba culture in the 17th century, or the cultures of Senegambia in the 15th and 16th centuries, or the culture of Angola in the 19th century, and the cultures of Nubia several, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, which were the ancestor cultures of the regimes of the pharaohs. And I also think it's sort of an oddly anachronistic and out of the way to be preoccupied with this question, since they weren't. There's no very good reason to think that the Egyptians, the later pharaohs, who do tend to look lighter skinned, were particularly preoccupied with the question of their color or the color of their subjects, who were like many of the inhabitants of contemporary Egypt, though for different reasons, of a pretty wide range of colors. Between the pharaohs and the present, of course, between the pharaohs and the slave trade, the Arabs arrived in this region. Islam arrived, but also significant populations from the Arabian Peninsula migrated across. And so the sort of taking literal connection in the genetic sense again, it's rather unclear what the literal connection is between contemporary Egyptians and the people who were there at the time of the pharaohs. So I want to say you can explore the question of the literal connection in some kind of somatic or biological sense. You won't get biologists very interested in this, for reasons I tried to suggest. Or you can look at the cultural connections, and there I think the cultural connections are much clearer, and frankly, in my view, more interesting, with more recent sub-Saharan African cultures, the ones from which many of the slaves came. I'm frankly very puzzled by the obsession with Egypt. For the last 30 years, a significant body of scholarship has been constructed on the history of Africa in the pre-colonial period, and a good deal of work has also been done on colonial history and the imperial history. That has given us a very rich picture of the many cultures of the Sidonic regions of West Africa and of the coast of Guinea and of the Angolan coast, and also of the parts of Africa from which very few, if any, slaves came to the New World, because most of the East African slave trade was to Arabia. This is fascinating stuff. I think it should be taught in American schools. I think it should be taught to everybody, whatever their own literal connection with it, because it's part of the history of our kind, our human kind, and because it tells us something about what it is to be human, because I think that the study of the humanities is about learning about the range of possibilities in human culture, and we can't learn about that range if we focus too narrowly on one place or one time, which is why I think both history and that is going backwards within one set of traditions and also going outwards and looking at other traditions are both very important. But I do find the obsession with Egypt just peculiar. And I really do think it does have some, I'm afraid that the explanation does have something to do with it, the reactive character of this kind of Afrocentrism, the fact that it's simply battening on to the Eurocentrism that it's supposed to be in opposition to and buying into its categories. And it seems to me just deeply intellectually reactionary in that sense. It's a step backwards. And a step backwards, I don't mind going backwards. I wish that Boston could go backwards in some ways, though not in others. But so I'm not against going backwards in say, but I am against going backwards in the wrong direction. And this seems to me a step backwards and in the wrong direction, and therefore to be regretted.
Yeah, I feel the same way, and I think that they can make a much stronger argument by dealing with the connections to West Africa.
Yes, I agree. And if I may say one more thing about this, there's another element of this that worries me. It's a diversion from attention to African American history. African American history is very interesting. There are plenty of things to be proud of in African American history. That's one of the reasons why I enjoy teaching it. I mean, I teach African American intellectual history, I don't teach social and political history, but that's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating, the ways in which African Americans constructed literary and cultural traditions, both before and after emancipation, especially after, I think, but from the point of view of intellectual history. And there are plenty of things to gain the attention of children of all races in that process, and for them to be proud of, amongst other things, as Americans. I mean, as white kids can be proud of African Americans for having done these things if we had the imagination to teach them how to be. And I think Afrocentrism has been somewhat diversionary from the task of learning how to teach the African American history, which also has been deeply enriched in the last 20 years, and African history is sort of 30, but I think African American history has really changed in the late, as a result of the intellectual changes of the late 60s.
Professor Appiah, you have outlined, I think, a very liberal and, if I may say so, humane multiculturalism. One of the arguments that the Afrocentrists make is that they need to reinforce cultural and racial self-esteem. And one can see the appeal of this for communities that may suffer difficulties in the present, difficulties of family life, difficulties of class. The idea of belonging to a cultural aristocracy, we built the pyramids and so on, is very powerful. And in this sense, the appeal of Afrocentrism resembles that of the old Eurocentrism. Mm-hmm. Your multiculturalism doesn't offer that at all. Do you think that self-esteem is important? And if Afrocentrism is not going to be the legitimate grounds for building it, what alternative basis might there be for making kids feel that accomplishment that allows them to do well?
Okay. Well, that's like all good questions, a complicated question. And I'd like to start by saying that, of course, self-esteem is a good. Indeed, it's part of the character, it seems to me, of democratic societies, that they aim to produce citizens with self-esteem, and that distinguishes them, I think, from many other kinds of societies where, for large parts of the population, esteem comes from not from your, as it were, from yourself, but from your dependency and relation to somebody else. So I take the self-esteem to be a sort of central part of democratic psychology. The reason why Afrocentrists largely defend self-esteem, however, is not that. It's an instrumental reason. They think it's a good thing because they think people will learn better if they have self-esteem, and this is regularly said and sometimes written, but much more often said. You hear this argument. There is very little evidence for this proposition. There is very little evidence for the proposition that self-esteem is causally connected this way with learning. The evidence mostly seems to me to go the other way. What it shows is that if people are successful in learning, that builds their self-esteem, right? That's the exact opposite causal direction. The causal direction alleged here is, well, if we make them feel good about themselves, they'll do well. The evidence in the educational psychology literature seems to me to be, I'm not an expert on this, but I have read some stuff, the evidence is that it's the other way around. The evidence is that if you give children real challenges and teach them how to meet and overcome them, that builds self-esteem. So there is a connection between self-esteem and academic success, but it's exactly the wrong way round in this argument. And so, and that's very important because it then leads to the wrong conclusion. The wrong conclusion is you're going to make people do better by simply telling them good things about themselves, rather than by challenging them, rather than by holding them to, giving them the tools, intellectual and material. I mean, the books and the pencils and the computers, the goods with which to learn and to succeed in learning. And if we do that, I think we will, of course, build self-esteem. So I regard self-esteem, I think there are two things wrong with the way in which self-esteem is mobilized in much of this argument. One is that it isn't defended as what I think it is, which is a sort of intrinsically valuable thing, but merely instrumentally. And then the instrumental argument seems not to be supported by the evidence. So, as it were, it's wrong every way, the way in which it's actually mobilized. And it's wrong, it seems to me, even though self-esteem is tremendously important, and even though if we did develop a valuable, an education that challenged children and allowed them to succeed, we would, in fact, I think, build self-esteem. At least that seems to be the evidence. But the notion that it's somehow, if you'll excuse me for saying this, a very American idea that, that you'll make people better by just telling them good things about themselves. Just telling them that they have wonderful ancestors and that they're descended from princes and queens and kings in Africa or Egypt or somewhere. I mean, my view about Western culture is that it belongs to anyone who's willing to struggle to learn it. And that's my view about any culture. And I think we should all be struggling now to try and understand and learn from many cultural traditions as we develop an increasingly interconnected set of political, economic, and cultural institutions on the planet. And in that context, the notion of limiting yourself to the study and identification with traditions with which you have some alleged genealogical connection seems to me hopelessly out of sync with what we need.
Yes, hi, MD Carnegie with the Public Interest magazine, also a freelance literary critic. In light of your role as a philosopher, I feel a bit guilty trying to drag you into the muck of practical matters, but I wanted to ask you two questions which dovetail somewhat with Mr. D'Souza's question previously. One often hears it said nowadays that the American educational system is incapable of performing even the most rudimentary tasks, getting the kids to know what happened in 1776 and so forth. To the extent that that's true, how do you respond to charges that efforts to make education more multicultural are in effect very much like adding more bricks to a load that already it can't support? And as a corollary to that, are not groups that have felt themselves excluded or ill-treated by the traditional educational system somewhat justified in anchoring their own educational systems around their own particular ethnicities or histories?
Well, I think that it's nothing that I've said should be taken to be denying the fact that many, especially sort of minority, especially poorer children in our society are being given a very raw educational deal, and that part of the reason for that is racism, and that something should be done about it. The question is whether an appropriate response to that recognition is, as it were, emphasizing and deepening the fissures or trying to do something about them. That's an answer to your last point. On the question of we do know how to teach relatively well in this country. I teach at an institution which regularly manages to find some pretty smart, well-educated people every year to add to its body, and not all of them are foreigners. Some of them were educated in the United States from the very beginning. Some of them have never been anywhere else. And I wrote a recommendation the other day for a young man who was applying for a Harvard summer scholarship, which allows students who've never been abroad just to go abroad. He was a young African American. Well, so it's not that we don't know how to do this. We can. There are good examples of how to teach, and there are places that are successfully teaching people. Now, and I am not an expert on these public policy questions, and I'm sort of against pontificating about public policy questions that you don't know anything about. Nevertheless, let me say at least this, that I really do think that one of the major problems in the way that we're thinking about these issues as a culture at the moment is that we are attending so much to what goes on in the worst schools that we forget the circumstances that surround them. Not far away from where I live in Boston in the last few days, there was what you can only call a race riot between black and white working class children in a school in South Boston. As a result of that, it's now the case that many of the black kids in this school have to be bused from the school to the T, to the transit, the underground transit, what do you call it in this country, metro system, because they're not safe between the school and the T stop, which they have to get to in order to take the T home. Boston is an incredibly segregated city, and there is a huge amount of violence outside the schools. It seems to me the notion that you can solve the problem of teenage violence by having metal detectors at the doors of the schools is loony. It's loony because all that means is they'll do more of their fighting outside. The question is, how did it come about that we got a situation where urban children, black and white in this country, urban young teenagers, young men and women, are going around with knives and guns and so on and killing each other? And also killing themselves to some extent with drugs of various sorts. I mean, that's the problem. And that you can't blame, it seems to me crazy to think that if we do a lousy job outside the school, that we can expect to do any good inside the school. I mean, maybe the school can help. Maybe the school can be a center of community attempts to deal with some of the community's problems. But you won't solve those problems which are created outside the school. It seems to me, you won't be able to solve all of them, even if you can solve some of them. You won't be able to solve all of them by changing the curriculum or by having more hall monitors or whatever. I think there's something very strange about this discussion in which it's alleged to be the fault of the schools that people arrive at them with guns. They don't sell guns. They don't teach people how to use guns in any school that I know of. They have rules against them. What more do you expect them to do? There are other sources, other areas and sources of responsibility than the school. So I really do think that we ought to attend a little bit more when we're thinking about the bad schooling in our worst schools, to the ways in which that depends upon other bad things that are going on, and to the fact that those things are not going to be solved by changing the curriculum, or, to answer your question finally, by maintaining some older, more rigorous curriculum in which everybody's just learning, you know, to recite the Bible backwards and to count to 733 and to, you know, spell anti-disestablishmentarianism or whatever you think the ideal is of an old-fashioned educational system. That isn't, multiculturalism is not a panacea for all these problems, and nor is it the case that, but nor I think is it the case that we can avoid doing these things if we want to solve, if we want to get away from some of the problems that the lack of mutual understanding does add to the many other burdens of dealing with life in the late 20th century in the United States.
My name is Patrick Okata, and I'm from the American University. And advocating multiculturalism, at least your strain of it, in a way, is almost, I would say, the pragmatic way of our solution to the problem. And at least it will elevate the discourse away from Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism. But I also see a problematic in that strain of multiculturalism because it fails to deal with the whole issue of asymmetries in the power relationship between those that find the status quo unacceptable and so want something to be done to it, particularly the Afrocentrists, and those that can do something about it but do not feel like doing anything about it. So how do you reconcile that problematic?
Well, I sometimes say to students of mine that I only have one meta view. My meta view is that it's not a good idea to have only one approach. And in particular, it's not a good idea to have only one theory. And furthermore, I think let me not go into that. Of course there are problems of asymmetries of wealth and power in this society as in every other, and of course, if you care about them, something should be done about them. The question is whether that should be, which is, in my view, a separable problem from the problems of misunderstanding between people of goodwill that also occur, should be latched onto this other set of issues that I was trying to address. So it's not, because I didn't say anything about asymmetries of power and wealth and so on, doesn't mean I don't think there's a problem about them. I wasn't talking about that. And furthermore, I don't think that anybody's under an obligation to talk about it all the time. I think we should talk about some other things as well. And I think that the issues I was talking about are independently worthy of attention and worth doing something about, despite the fact that they don't directly address the questions of asymmetries of power. Now, however, it is inevitable if you practice part of what I preach, if you practice teaching the American political system and you practice teaching democratic values, that these issues will come up for discussion in class, and you ought to be ready for that. You ought to discuss them honestly, and you ought to be able to make young people aware of the range of reasonable opinion on these questions. And my view is that by the time you get to college, you ought to be entitled to say what your opinion is as a teacher, while offering students who don't initially agree with you evidence of the existence of people who don't agree with you and of the sorts of things they say. So yeah, that's very important too. But and one question that I think divides different strands of multiculturalism is the extent to which the questions are separable. I happen to think that they are. I happen to think that that some of the worst, that there are problems in our kind of modern society, and this applies not just to the United States but to the industrialized world, problems of sort of ethnic diversity that are not simply a matter of racism and not simply a matter of power relations. They're matters of ignorance of the sort that a school is ideally placed to address. But I don't think that we should avoid the questions and the disagreements about the extent to which inequities in power and racism and other kinds of class problems of class affect what goes on in this country. I just think that that's not the same issue.
I just thought they were somewhat connected, because if you're dealing with asymmetries in the power relationships, then of course, who determines the curriculum? I mean, that becomes a question. And
Good.
Determining the curriculum
Yes.
really goes to the whole issue of what you were talking about in terms of your strain of
I agree.
multiculturalism.
Well, on the question of determining the curriculum, I've a couple of times adverted to the fact that I think that diversity, the relatively diffuse character of power in the American educational system, by contrast, say, with France, which is, I guess, the other extreme, is a virtue. And I think that my view about how the curriculum should be determined is that it should be determined in the way that things should be determined in a democratic society, that is by reasoned argument among citizens. You're skeptical, I'm sure, that that'll necessarily produce improvement. And I have two things to say about that. One is, yeah, democracy sometimes doesn't work. And two, one of the reasons why there is failure, why school boards and so on often seem to be out of sync with the needs of children, is because not enough people do participate democratically in these things. The turnout rates for elections for school boards, especially in cities, are monstrously low. That's not a failure of the system, that's a failure of people to use the system. And I won't, as it were, allow anybody to blame the system until we've tried it. So we should try it. I believe in parental and citizen involvement. I work on the algebra project and the Facing History and other projects that work in the schools in my city, and I think we all should, but both as voters, which is a minuscule kind of involvement, but also as members of parent-teachers associations, as members of boards of voluntary societies and so on, in those very American ways of participation, it seems to me. So the answer is democracy.
Hortense Bukowski, I work for the Labor Department. My question has nothing to do with that. I remember a lecture at Harvard on cultural pluralism, and I wondered which was very appealing, and I think would be appealing to anybody that isn't of the majority culture, and many of those that are. How do you differentiate your multiculturalism? Is it a descendant of cultural pluralism? And Is it a sort of a movement or philosophy or how?
Well, I said sort of embarrassedly from time to time, I sort of moved between the two because I actually think that what's sort of good in, just sort of let me back up and say, remember what the thesis is that what multiculturalisms have in common is the idea that you don't solve the problems of diversity by imposing unity through picking one group and imposing its culture. My own sympathies are with a tradition of responses to that fact that used to be called pluralism, yes. I think of pluralism of that sort as the ancestor of one strand of multiculturalism. There are other strands within multiculturalism that have to do with things that I'm not so sympathetic with. I mean, but you probably wouldn't be sympathetic with them either, so there's probably not much point in my telling you what they are. So, yeah, I think that that there's much to be said for the older pluralism discussions. They were perhaps more optimistic than I am. I ended by saying that this is difficult and that's why we have to work at it. I think it is important to follow Gramsci, who said, as you know, that we should be, optimism, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. I think, intellectually speaking, it looks difficult. And the most interesting thing about the United States is how well, on the whole, it's doing by comparison with some other plural societies, some other multi-ethnic societies, which basically means all societies above the size of Lesotho are now, and even Lesotho is quite ethnically diverse, actually, but that's another story. So we're doing pretty well, I think. I know that people feel we're not, and people are worried about it, but the fact is that there are now examples around the world, including ranging from Bosnia to Northern Ireland to East Timor to Sri Lanka, where people are doing significantly worse. So I think we should be wary. But I'm glad that things in this country haven't got anything like that far.
Let's make that the last question.
I'm Roger Clegg with the National Legal Center for the Public Interest. To what extent are the reforms that you would make ones that are best handled by public schools, and to what extent are they better handled by the other actors in the educational system, private schools and parents on their own?
Well, the sort of shortish answer is that, as you will have discovered by now, I don't know what a short answer is. But the shortish answer is something like this, that I think that ethnicity is created outside the state. It's created in families and communities and churches and things like that, synagogues, and increasingly in mosques and temples. And I think that the main task of public education, which is the shared education of the state, is to make sure that those all work along together. And a sane parent, in my view, in our kind of society, ought to be concerned to begin very early on to talk to his or her children about the fact that this is the kind of society that we have, and ought from very early on to talk about the fact that there are diverse opinions about certain central questions, and to bring a child up to deal with it. But in the end, the place that's going to be best equipped to do this is the school. Now, I actually don't think there's much difference here between public and private schools in terms of what they can do. It's true that the amount of legal constraint is greater in public schools. But in this country, by and large, communities where parents and other citizens choose to participate in the regulation of public education are communities where that can happen. And so I think that private schools should do it. Parents should attend to the parts of it that they can do, but obviously because most parents were brought up in an education system that didn't very well prepare people, I think, for multicultural character. Many parents are not well equipped to do this, and so we need to do it in schools. And there are difficulties in doing it in the public schools, I think, but they're not insuperable, and we have this enormous democratic resource in this country, if we choose to use it, namely the fact that our public education systems are regulated by local communities in a very diffuse system of power. If you made it a statement, you could have the last word.
I would harken back to two things that you said earlier. One was that one meta principle is that having one approach is not good.
Sure.
And one way to avoid that is to take the pressure for finding the right answer off the public schools and kind of diverse approach in different educational systems. The other point is that the kind of ethnic pride that's been talked about before as something that multiculturalists like, it seems to me is much less problematic than parents telling a child that you should be very proud, these are your ancestors, than it is when a teacher is telling you.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Maybe I should. I have got into trouble with this sentence that I said about, that I've said a couple of times in a couple of places about not worth teaching because it's yours or mine, but so on. What I meant by that was only applies in the context of the school. I'm just saying, in the context of public education, it's not appropriate for a teacher to say to a child, I'm teaching you this because it's yours. That's what I meant. Of course, as I revealed, I myself am not much susceptible to arguments of the form, this is interesting because it's yours, partly because I am such a product of such métissage. But I understand that appeal, and it's a perfectly appropriate thing, I think, and even if I didn't think it was appropriate, it'll go on anyway, for parents to do. No, I was making an argument about what's appropriate as a reason for teaching in a school. I do not think you should point at the child and say, I'm teaching you this because it's yours. I think you should say, in the public schools, we should be teaching children because there's a reason for them to know it. And the reasons there are to know things in our kind of society are pretty much such that everybody has a reason to know things of the same kind. That's the point. No, but I'm not against the idea of saying to a child, we do this because Granny did it, and great-great-granny did it, and everybody back to Moses, or whatever. I think that's well, I participate, as I indicated, in rituals of that kind, even though they're often not from traditions that I have that kind of connection to, and I find them very precious.
Please join me in thanking Don't forget that June 8th is the Don Kagan lecture on Pericles and democracy. I